All right, starting with W, what is the topic? This is the first thing you need to know. Basically, just read the instructions and decide what it is that you're actually going to be writing about. Number 2, R. Recognize what you know or what is the context. Basically, in other words, everything that you already know about what it is that you're going to be writing about. And you actually want to write this down, right? In your Google Doc, when you're going in, you're taking notes for your essays and you're planning it out, right? Obviously, start, name, student number, due date, class, name of assignment, topic, choose a title, right? But then you also need to write down everything that you already know, right? Because one of the greatest things you can do is to synthesize from pre-existing knowledge on why something is important and why it actually matters, why the experiment was done in the first place, and why people care, actually, because that's the main thing. Nobody cares unless it's meaningful, right? So you have to find the meaning and then talk about it. So the easiest way to do that is, one, know what already exists. And if you already know what already exists, then that's even better. This also gives you a context to write from. What is your personal frame, right? How do you think? How are you going to show your thoughts on this? So after R is I, and I stands for information gathering. This is the research part of your research paper. This is where you go online on Google and you find a bunch of scholarly articles. Gather enough information to actually talk about what it is that you're talking about. Or maybe this is the article that you have to find, right? You have to go and find an article. Okay, obviously these are the steps that are pretty obvious, but I'm going to get into exactly how to approach everything in E here at the bottom. So yeah, gather the information. Then T is you're going to write your thesis statement. Now that you have the information, now that you know your own context that you're writing about, now you know what the heck the topic is, you're going to write your thesis statement. This is your claim. This is exactly what you think about what's going on or what you predict to happen. Okay? Then you're going to go into E, and this last one is actually another framework built in a framework. You're going to love this. Okay, this is the essay framework. First E is to elaborate on your thesis. Now what does this mean? What does elaboration mean? Well, it means you need to define the variables that you're looking for, right? What's the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? What are the controls? And what are the confounding variables? In other words, what are the things that they didn't test for that might have influenced the relationship between the independent and dependent variables? It's mainly just important to know what those are so that you can talk about them later, right? Okay, the first S is the structure of the experiment or methods. Explain how the experiment went down. Or if you're writing your own experiment, explain how you would go about testing your thesis statement. What are the methods? What are the groups? What are the variables, right? Once you have the methods laid out, it's very easy to discern what data you're trying to collect. But you can also just start with the data. Like, what data do I need to prove this point? Right? If you elaborate on your thesis, you're like, I'm going to test the relationship of this on this. You need to know what this is at baseline, right? You need to know what the effect is, what the change was. And then you also need to be able to compare that to the rest of the population. So let's say that this was, the effect of stress on immunity, right? How well your body can fend off colds, immunocompetence, right? You need to know, one, not just where the average person started or where the person who was sick started, like let's say it was sick people versus healthy people, how long they stayed sick, right? You don't just need to get that from the sick people, how long they stayed sick normally, and then the sick people, how long they stayed sick if they were stressed, right? And how would you measure stress? But also you need to compare that to the healthy population. How long does it take a healthy person who is or is not stressed, both two more groups, to get over a cold, and what type of cold, right? Because that also you need to control, confounding variable. So you need to make sure that your methods are clear and what type of data you need to collect. Then you also need to know not just what type of data you're going to collect, but how to analyze it. There are many different ways you can do this. You can do ANOVA tests, you can do t-tests, you can do split tests, you can do a division test where you group groups versus high versus low, but you don't necessarily quantify it. those tests are good for understanding the data, but you also need to know that it will inhibit the statistical relevance and validity of whatever it is that you're testing. So you need to address that later down and below, right? So structure. The next one is the second S. You need to source your reasoning. I assume that all of you don't want an academic strike. So source everything, right? There are sometimes your professor will be like, okay, if you mention the source once in the beginning of the paragraph, you don't need to mention it again. I do it after every sentence because I'd rather be safe than sorry, right? So source everything. This includes the main source. In other words, if you were doing like a literature review or a review paper on an article, main source. Or this could be the main source of your idea that you're writing about. You also need the ancillary sources, so supporting sources, which will support your claims that you make, okay? And sometimes you need a justification source. Why? Why is your thing relevant? If anything's common knowledge, you don't need to source it. But what is common knowledge? That's kind of up to the experiment, I guess, or the audience of what you're trying to write to. So for instance, if you're writing to third graders, they're not going to know, what some of these things mean. They're not really going to know what a confounding variable is. So you might want to define it and find out where the definition of that came from and to source it. Yeah, that's something that you, like if you're writing to, academic professors, you don't really need to source all of that. You can just say like, yeah, I mean, it's common knowledge that like the earth is round. I mean, you can debate me all you want on that, but the earth is round, okay? So these are the types of sources you need. Okay, A, you need to assess the results. This is whether you're going to reject or support your hypothesis, your thesis statement, although sometimes they're not the same thing, and your data analysis. What does your data mean? Right, you have all this data, but you need to explain it to people. Like they're not gonna know. This is the discussion part. Whether it was supported or rejected, why, what data shows that, how does that compare to real life? Is it generalizable? Okay? And last, you have the why, which is your opinion. Your opinion is only valuable at the end. Everything else is objective. Your opinion should cover, roughly speaking, future experiments, your reasoning for the research. In other words, what existed before, what knowledge gap does your research fill? What was your reasoning? Why did you do it, right? And why does it matter, right? And for the future experiments, what else can be done? How does this influence the field of whatever your research was about or whatever article you were writing about? Your opinion, if you state your strengths and weaknesses, it means that nobody else can, which makes your opinion more valid and stronger. You've already addressed the problems and perhaps presented solutions in future research in your own article, in your own writing, which means that nobody else is going to have the opportunity to do that, which makes your writing stronger. So follow all these steps, the right framework, the essay framework. Write your essay. Get good grades.